April 17, 1944, Camp Hereford, Texas. A gentle spring breeze swept across the dusty plains as the convoy of army trucks rumbled toward the hastily converted POW facility. Lieutenant Margaret Weber stood in the back of the lead vehicle, her hands gripping the metal rail, knuckles white with tension. The trucks contained 36 members of the German Women's Auxiliary Force, captured during the Allied push through Italy, now thousands of miles from home in the vast expanse of the Texas Panhandle. She believed they were being delivered to a primitive camp of deprivation and humiliation. Their captivity under American forces would surely be worse than death itself. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What follows is the untold story of how these German women, indoctrinated by years of Nazi propaganda, would have their most fundamental beliefs challenged not through force or punishment, but through an unexpected encounter with American culture, particularly the black American soldiers who guarded them and the Texas Cowboys who would transform their understanding of freedom, dignity, and humanity. The women had been captured near Monte Cassino in February, their communications unit overrun during the Allied advance. Most were in their early 20s, daughters of the Reich, raised on stories of German superiority and American depravity. Lieutenant Weber, at 28, was the highest-ranking officer among them, a dedicated party member since 1933, and a true believer in the Führer's vision. "Remember your training," Weber whispered to Helga Braun, a petite radio operator from Hamburg seated beside her. "Name, rank, identification number only. The Americans will try to trick us, especially the blacks. You've been warned about them." Helga nodded, her blue eyes wide with fear. Like many of the women, she had never been outside Germany before the war and now found herself on another continent, surrounded by enemies, including the dark-skinned soldiers they had been taught to fear above all others. The trucks slowed as they approached the camp gates. Through the swirling dust, the women could make out figures in American uniforms, many with dark skin, standing at attention. Colonel James Washington, commanding officer of the 92nd Buffalo Division security detail assigned to Camp Hereford, watched the trucks approach. At 42, Washington was a veteran of both World Wars, a career soldier who had fought discrimination at every rank to achieve his current position. "Remember, men," he addressed the soldiers lined up behind him, "these are the first female POWs to be housed in the American Southwest. The eyes of the War Department are on us. We will conduct ourselves with absolute professionalism." Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson nodded, standing ramrod straight beside his commanding officer. At 25, Johnson had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind his studies at Howard University and his family's small farm in Georgia. "Yes, sir," Johnson replied. "The men understand the significance." The trucks came to a halt. As the dust settled, the German women looked out at their reception committee, 24 black soldiers in crisp uniforms, standing at attention. Weber's face hardened. "Just as they said," she muttered. "They've put us under guard of Untermenschen." The first woman to descend from the truck was Ilse Hoffmann, the unit's doctor. As her boots touched Texas soil, she unconsciously reached for the Iron Cross pinned to her uniform, a decoration awarded for saving 12 wounded soldiers during an Allied bombing raid in Sicily. A soldier stepped forward to direct her, and Dr. Hoffmann froze, her hand dropping to her side. It was her first time seeing a black man in person. Sergeant Johnson noticed her reaction, but maintained his professional demeanor. "This way, ma'am," he said in perfect German, gesturing toward the processing area. The surprise was evident on Dr. Hoffmann's face, not just at being addressed in her native language, but at the courtesy in the soldier's tone. She had expected harsh treatment, perhaps even violence. One by one, the women disembarked, each experiencing the same shock upon facing their guards. The propaganda they had consumed for years had portrayed black Americans as savage, barely human. Yet here they stood, disciplined, professional soldiers showing no animosity. Colonel Washington approached Lieutenant Weber, who stood rigidly at attention, her gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to meet his eyes. "Lieutenant Weber," Washington said, consulting his clipboard, "I am Colonel James Washington, commanding officer of the security detail at Camp Hereford. You and your personnel will be processed according to the Geneva Convention. You will be treated with dignity and respect as long as you comply with camp regulations." Weber didn't respond, maintaining her 1,000-yard stare. Washington continued unfazed. "Your group will be housed in the eastern section of the camp, which has been modified for female prisoners. You will find the accommodations basic but adequate. Medical care, food rations, and exercise facilities are provided in accordance with international law." Dr. Hoffman stepped forward. "Our wounded," she asked cautiously, "are being attended to in our medical facility," Washington replied. "You'll be permitted to visit them after processing, Doctor. The women were led to a processing center where they surrendered personal items, received identification cards, and were assigned quarters." Throughout the procedure, they remained tense, clustering together protectively, watching the black soldiers with suspicion and fear. Private Helga Brown struggled to reconcile what she was experiencing with what she had been taught. The Americans were organized, efficient, and showed no signs of the barbarism she had expected. Most confusing of all, the black soldiers treated them with a professional courtesy that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had claimed. As the women were escorted to their barracks, they passed the men's POW section, where German Army and Navy personnel had been held for months. The male prisoners called out to them in German. "Watch out for the blacks," shouted one soldier. "They're animals when the officers aren't looking." Lieutenant Weber gave a slight nod of acknowledgement to the male prisoners, as if their warnings confirmed her beliefs. But Helga wasn't so certain anymore. Something didn't add up. The women's quarters consisted of 6 barracks, each housing 6 prisoners, with a separate building for washing and laundry. The accommodations were sparse but clean, bunks with mattresses, footlockers, a common area with tables and chairs and large windows that let in the Texas sunlight. "This is not what I expected," admitted Gerda Schmidt, the unit's communications specialist, as she placed her few permitted possessions in her footlocker. "Don't be fooled," Weber warned. "This is just for show. They're Americans. They care about appearances. The true test will come when night falls." That night the women barely slept, huddled together in their bunks, listening for approaching footsteps, for the attack they had been conditioned to expect. But the night passed peacefully, with only the occasional sound of guards making their rounds outside. The next morning brought another surprise. Breakfast was served in a dining hall. Powdered eggs, toast, coffee, and fruit. It was simple fare, but more substantial than what they had been eating in the final months before their capture in Italy, where German supply lines had been stretched thin. "They're feeding us better than our own army," whispered Eva Müller, the youngest of the group at 19. "Silence," Weber hissed. "It's a tactic to make us complacent." After breakfast, they were introduced to the camp routine: roll call, mealtimes, permitted recreation areas, work assignments. To their surprise, they were to be paid for any labor they performed in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Sergeant Johnson was assigned as liaison to the women's section. His fluent German made him the logical choice, but Colonel Washington had another reason for selecting him. "Johnson, you're from Georgia, right?" Washington asked in his office after the women had been settled. "Yes, sir. Small town outside Atlanta." "So you understand something about living under oppression, about being treated as less than human because of who you are." Johnson's expression remained professional, but his eyes reflected understanding. "Yes, sir. These women have been fed lies their entire lives. They've been taught to hate people who look like us, to see us as inferior. Sound familiar?" "Very, sir. I'm not saying forgive the Nazis or what they stand for," Washington clarified, "but these women are also victims of that system in their own way. Show them something different than what they expect, not because they deserve it, but because that's who we are." Johnson nodded. "Understood. Colonel." The first week passed without incident. The women maintained their distance from the guards, speaking only when necessary. Lieutenant Weber enforced discipline, reminding her unit that they remained German soldiers despite their captivity. The turning point came during the second week, when the camp received visitors from a nearby ranch. Richard Chambers was a local cattle rancher who periodically brought supplies to the camp. On this occasion, he arrived with his son Thomas and several ranch hands, including Juan Vasquez and Charlie Two Horses, a Comanche cowboy who had worked the Chambers Ranch for 20 years. The visitors brought fresh beef, vegetables from local farms, and mail that had been cleared by censors. As they unloaded their trucks, the German women watched from the recreation yard, which was separated from the delivery area by a chain-link fence. Thomas Chambers, a 17-year-old who had been deemed unfit for military service due to a childhood injury that left him with a permanent limp, noticed the women watching. Unlike many locals who viewed the German prisoners with hostility, Thomas was curious. "Pa, look," he said, nodding toward the fence. "Those are the German women everyone's been talking about." Richard Chambers glanced over. At 53, he had fought in the First World War and harbored no love for Germans. But he was also a pragmatic man who believed in judging people as individuals. "Best keep your distance, son," he advised. "They're enemy soldiers, not a sightseeing attraction." But Thomas was already walking toward the fence, drawn by the novelty of the situation. Charlie Two Horses followed, more out of concern for the boy than interest in the prisoners. "Howdy," Thomas called as he approached. "You all settling in okay?" The German women stared back blankly, not understanding his thick Texas accent. Sergeant Johnson, who had been monitoring the recreation period, stepped in. "They don't speak much English," he explained to Thomas. Then, turning to the women, he translated the greeting into German. Several of the women looked uncertain, but Eva Müller, always the most curious, replied hesitantly in broken English, "We are. Okay, thank you." Thomas smiled broadly. "Well, that's good to hear. I'm Thomas Chambers. My family's ranch is about 10 miles east of here." As Johnson translated, Charlie Two Horses remained silent, observing. His presence drew the attention of the German women, who had never seen a Native American before. "What tribe is he from?" Dr. Hoffman asked Johnson, her scientific curiosity momentarily overcoming her reserve. Johnson relayed the question, and Charlie responded in his deep, measured voice, "Comanche. My people have lived on these plains for hundreds of years, before any white man or German woman set foot here." When this was translated, the women exchanged glances. Their education had included very little about Native Americans, and what they did know came primarily from romanticized German novels about the American West. "He's a real Indian," Eva whispered to Helga, who nodded, equally fascinated. Lieutenant Weber, who had been watching this interaction with disapproval, finally intervened. "Ladies, step back from the fence," she ordered in German. "We do not fraternize with the enemy." But the seed of curiosity had been planted. For many of the women, this brief interaction represented their first unscripted contact with Americans, and with people of color who defied the racial stereotypes they had been taught. That evening, discussions in the barracks centered on the visitors. "The cowboy was just a boy," Eva remarked, "younger than any of us." "And the Indian," added Gerda. "He didn't look like the savages in the stories. The Negro soldier speaks better German than most people in Berlin," Dr. Hoffman noted. "He must be educated." Lieutenant Weber listened to these observations with growing concern. "You're all being naive," she interrupted. "This is exactly how they want you to react. First, they show you kindness to lower your guard. Then comes the true agenda." "And what agenda is that, Lieutenant?" asked Dr. Hoffman, her tone carefully neutral. "The destruction of Germany and everything we stand for," Weber replied firmly. "They know they're winning the war. Now they want to win our minds as well." Her words cast a pall over the conversation. The women retired to their bunks, but many lay awake, contemplating the contradictions between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing. The following day brought a development that would further challenge their preconceptions. Colonel Washington announced that the women would be permitted to work outside the camp, assisting with harvesting at local farms, facing labor shortages due to the war. "Participation is voluntary," he explained through Sergeant Johnson's translation. "Those who choose to work will receive payment in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Transportation and security will be provided." Lieutenant Weber immediately objected. "This is a violation of our rights as prisoners of war. We cannot be compelled to support the American war effort." "With respect, Lieutenant, Johnson translated Washington's response. Agricultural work is not considered direct support of war operations under the convention. The food you help harvest feeds civilians as well as military. But as the colonel said, participation is voluntary. The offer sparked heated debate among the women. Some saw it as an opportunity to escape the monotony of camp life, while others, loyal to Weber, viewed it as collaboration with the enemy. In the end, 12 women, including Dr. Hoffman, Eva Müller, and Helga Braun, volunteered for the work detail. Lieutenant Weber and the others remained in camp, their disapproval evident. The first work assignment came 3 days later at the Chambers Ranch. The women were transported under guard, including Sergeant Johnson and 4 other soldiers. They arrived to find Richard Chambers waiting with his ranch hands. "I didn't expect so many volunteers," Chambers remarked to Johnson. "Thought they'd be too proud to work our land." "People get bored in captivity," Johnson replied, "and they're curious about life outside the wire." The German women were assigned to harvest vegetables from the ranch's large garden, tomatoes, squash, beans, and peppers that would supply both the ranch and the camp kitchen. The work was straightforward but physically demanding under the Texas sun. As they worked, Thomas Chambers and Charlie Two Horses brought water and showed them techniques to make the harvesting more efficient. Though communication was limited by the language barrier, gestures and demonstrations bridged the gap. During a water break, Eva noticed the horses in a corral nearby. She walked to the fence drawn by the beautiful animals. Growing up in Munich, she had rarely seen horses except in parades or pulling carts. Charlie. Two Horses noticed her interest and approached. "You like horses?" he asked, with Johnson translating. Eva nodded enthusiastically. "They're beautiful, so strong and free," Charlie smiled. "Not so different from people in that way." He whistled and a chestnut mare trotted over. "This is Willow. Would you like to meet her?" After Johnson translated, Eva looked hesitant but nodded. Charlie demonstrated how to let the horse smell your hand before touching her. Eva followed his instructions, her face lighting up when the mare nuzzled her palm. "In Germany, I never got to be this close to horses," she explained through Johnson. "They belong to wealthy people or the military. Here, horses are tools, companions, sometimes family," Charlie replied. "A good horse is worth more than gold on the plains." Thomas joined them, leading a palomino. "This is Sunflower, she's mine. Would you like to learn to ride sometime?" When Johnson translated this offer, Eva's eyes widened. "Is that allowed?" "I don't see why not," Thomas replied. "Pa says idle hands make trouble. Better to keep everyone busy with something useful." This exchange was observed by the other women, who gradually drifted over to see the horses. Even Dr. Hoffman showed interest, revealing that she had ridden as a girl but hadn't been on a horse since before the war. Only Lieutenant Weber, who had reluctantly joined the work detail to monitor her unit, remained aloof, watching disapprovingly from the edge of the garden. The work day ended with the women loading harvested vegetables onto trucks. Despite their fatigue, there was a palpable shift in their demeanor, a relaxation, an openness that hadn't been present before. On the ride back to camp, Helga asked Sergeant Johnson, "Will we come back tomorrow?" "That depends on Colonel Washington," Johnson replied, "and on whether Mr. Chambers was satisfied with today's work." "I hope we do," Helga said softly, surprising herself with the admission. The work detail became a regular assignment. 3 times a week, the volunteer group traveled to the Chambers Ranch or other local farms. As days turned into weeks, more of the German women requested to join, until only Lieutenant Weber and her most loyal followers remained behind. True to his word, Thomas Chambers began teaching some of the women to ride. Under the watchful eyes of the guards, small groups would receive basic horsemanship lessons in the ranch's corral. For women who had spent years in military discipline, followed by the confinement of captivity, these brief moments on horseback represented an unexpected freedom. Dr. Hoffman, who had initially been reserved, found herself drawn into conversation with Richard Chambers about medical practices on the frontier. Despite his wariness of Germans, Chambers respected professional knowledge, and the doctor's questions about treating injuries and illnesses on remote ranches engaged his practical nature. In the old days, he explained through Sergeant Johnson's translation, a rancher needed to be his own doctor. Set bones, stitch wounds deliver babies, human and animal alike. Not so different from a field surgeon, Dr. Hoffman noted. We work with what we have, not what we wish we had. This common ground, pragmatism in the face of limited resources, provided a basis for respect that transcended their opposing sides in the war. Even Charlie Two Horses, who rarely spoke of his past, began sharing stories of Comanche history with the fascinated German women. Through Johnson's translations, he described his people's tradition as horsemen, how they had adapted European horses to create one of the world's greatest cavalry cultures. Before the white man's horses came, he explained, my people hunted on foot. After, we controlled territory larger than Germany from here to the mountains in the west. These stories contradicted the simplistic view of Native Americans that the women had absorbed from popular culture. Charlie was neither the noble savage of romantic fiction nor the primitive stereotype of propaganda. He was a complex individual with a rich cultural heritage and a direct connection to the land they now stood upon. For Eva Müller, these revelations were particularly impactful. The youngest and most impressionable of the group, she had been raised in the Hitler Youth, where complex realities were reduced to simplistic ideologies. Now she was encountering people who defied categorization. Black soldiers who spoke her language better than she did, Native Americans with sophisticated cultural traditions, and Texans whose hospitality extended even to enemy prisoners. One afternoon after a riding lesson, Eva sat on the corral fence beside Thomas Chambers, with Sergeant Johnson nearby to translate. In school they told us Americans were soft and decadent, she admitted, that you could never win because you lacked discipline and racial purity. Thomas laughed when this was translated. Soft? Try working cattle from sunup to sundown in August. As for purity, look around. This ranch runs on the strength of whites, Mexicans, Indians all working together. Diversity isn't weakness. It's how we survive out here. Eva considered this. But they told you a lot of things, Thomas interrupted gently. Once Johnson had translated her words, maybe it's time to decide for yourself what's true. This conversation stayed with Eva long after they returned to camp. That night, she approached Lieutenant Weber, who had been increasingly isolated as more women joined the work details. Lieutenant, Eva began hesitantly, I've been thinking about what we're experiencing here. Weber looked up from the book she was reading, a German translation of Nietzsche, one of the few personal possessions she had been allowed to keep. And what profound insights has picking vegetables given you, Private Müller? Weber's tone was scathing. Eva hesitated but pressed on. The Americans, they're not what we were told. Neither are the black soldiers or the Indians. They've treated us with respect, even kindness. Weber closed her book slowly. They've treated us like animals in a zoo, Eva, feeding us, patting our heads when we perform tricks. Don't mistake calculated manipulation for kindness. But why would they bother? We're just a handful of women, unimportant in the larger war. Because that's how Americans think. They believe they can win everyone over with their wealth and their pretense of freedom. They show you horses and let you play cowgirl, and suddenly you forget what they're doing to our homeland, to our families. Weber's voice had risen, drawing the attention of other women in the barracks. Eva stood her ground. I haven't forgotten anything. But I've learned new things too. Maybe the world isn't as simple as we were taught. Weber rose from her bunk, her face flushed with anger. This is exactly what they want, to sow doubt, to turn us against each other and against our fatherland. You're young and foolish, Eva, but I expected better from you. The confrontation might have escalated further if Dr. Hoffman hadn't intervened, placing herself physically between the two women. That's enough, she said firmly. We're all tired. This discussion can wait for morning. Weber glared at both women before returning to her bunk, her posture rigid with disapproval. Later that night, as most of the barracks slept, Dr. Hoffman sat beside Eva's bunk. You shouldn't antagonize her, Hoffman whispered. She's clinging to her beliefs because without them, what does she have left? But if those beliefs are wrong, Eva asked. Hoffman sighed. That's a question each of us must answer for ourselves. But remember, we will all have to live together when this war ends, whether here or back in Germany. Choose your battles wisely. As June turned to July, the Texas heat intensified. Work schedules shifted to earlier mornings and later evenings to avoid the midday sun. Despite the challenging conditions, the women's morale improved. The physical labor, connection with the outdoors, and regular interaction with the local community provided purpose and relief from the monotony of captivity. Colonel Washington noted these changes with satisfaction. His reports to command highlighted the success of the work program in maintaining discipline and building positive relations with the local community, which had initially been skeptical about having enemy prisoners, especially women, in their midst. Sergeant Johnson developed a particularly effective working relationship with the German women. His fluent German, calm demeanor, and unwavering professionalism earned their grudging respect, even from those who still harbored racist views. For some, like Helga Braun, this respect began to evolve into something more, a questioning of fundamental assumptions. "How did you learn German so well?" Helga asked Johnson one day as they traveled back to camp. "I studied at Howard University before the war," he explained. "German literature and philosophy, Goethe, Schiller, Kant." "A Negro university?" Helga asked, using the term she had been taught was polite. "Yes, one of the best in America for colored students," Johnson replied, without offense at her terminology. "My father wanted me to be a minister, but I was drawn to languages." "And then the war came," Helga said softly. Johnson nodded. "And then the war came. I enlisted right after Pearl Harbor." Even though America treats people like you," Helga struggled to phrase her question delicately. "Even though segregation exists? Even though I face discrimination?" Johnson finished for her. "Yes, because despite its flaws, America is my home, and its ideals, even when imperfectly realized, are worth fighting for." This response gave Helga much to consider. If Johnson could remain loyal to a country that didn't always treat him as an equal, what did that say about her own relationship to Germany and its ideology? Meanwhile, Lieutenant Weber grew increasingly isolated. As more women embraced the work program and developed relationships with the locals, Weber's authority diminished. She maintained rigid discipline among her few remaining loyal followers, but her influence over the group as a whole was waning. The situation came to a head in late July when Richard Chambers proposed a special project. The ranch was preparing for a cattle drive, moving several hundred head to new grazing land. With many ranch hands serving in the military, Chambers was shorthanded. "I'd like to request some of your prisoners to help with the preparations," Chambers told Colonel Washington. "Not the actual drive, that would be too far from camp, but getting things organized, checking equipment, preparing supplies." Washington was hesitant. "That goes beyond vegetable picking, Mr. Chambers. I'd need approval from higher up." "They'd be under guard the whole time," Chambers assured him, "and it would be valuable experience for them. Most are going to need new skills after the war, especially if things in Germany are as bad as the papers say." Washington considered this. "Let me discuss it with the liaison officer and the senior prisoner. I make no promises." When Sergeant Johnson presented the proposal to the women, the response was mixed. Many were excited by the opportunity, particularly those who had developed an interest in horsemanship. Others were hesitant, concerned about the more complex work and longer hours. Lieutenant Weber was openly opposed. "This is inappropriate labor for prisoners of war," she argued. "Preparing for a cattle drive is directly supporting the American economy, which supports their war effort." Colonel Washington listened to these objections through Johnson's translation, then responded carefully. "The Geneva Convention permits voluntary agricultural work, Lieutenant. Ranching falls under that category. No one will be required to participate, and standard payment will apply." Despite Lieutenant Weber's objections, 23 of the 36 women volunteered for the cattle drive preparations. Weber watched with thinly veiled contempt as they departed for the Chambers Ranch on a clear August morning, the Texas sun already promising another scorching day. "They're making a mistake," Weber muttered to Gertrude Keller, one of her few remaining loyal followers. "They think they're going on an adventure, but they're just being used." Keller nodded dutifully. At 34, she was the oldest of the prisoners, and had served in the Nazi Party since its earliest days. Like Weber, she viewed the other women's growing comfort with their American captors as a form of betrayal. The younger ones were never properly committed to the cause, Keller observed. This is separating the wheat from the chaff. Weber's eyes narrowed as she watched the trucks disappear down the dusty road. Perhaps that's for the best. When we return to Germany, the Führer will need to know who remained loyal and who was corrupted. But beneath her rigid exterior, Weber nursed a growing doubt. News from Europe, carefully filtered though it was, suggested Germany's position was deteriorating rapidly. The invasion of Normandy, reported grudgingly by the camp newspaper, had established a solid Allied foothold in France. Italy had fallen. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. Privately, Weber had begun to question whether there would be a Germany to return to, at least not the Germany she had devoted her life to building. Meanwhile, the volunteers arrived at the Chambers Ranch to find it bustling with activity. Cowboys moved purposefully among horses and cattle, checking equipment, shoeing horses, and preparing supplies for the drive. The scale of the operation impressed the German women, many of whom had grown up in cities and had little experience with livestock or agriculture beyond their recent work in the vegetable gardens. Richard Chambers greeted them, with Sergeant Johnson translating as usual. "Thank you for coming. We've got a lot to do before the drive begins next week. We'll be moving 800 head of cattle 20 miles north to fresh grazing land." He gestured to Charlie, 2 horses who stood nearby. "Charlie will be trail boss for this drive. He'll assign you to different work groups based on your skills and what you've learned so far." Charlie nodded to the women. "Some of you have shown aptitude with horses. You'll help check tack and equipment. Others will assist with food preparation, medical supplies, and camp gear. Everyone has an important role." As Charlie assigned the women to their tasks, Eva Müller found herself directed to the horse barn, where Thomas Chambers was inspecting saddles. "You've got a good feel for the horses," Thomas told her through Johnson's translation. "I need someone to help check each saddle for damage. A broken strap 50 miles from nowhere can be a serious problem." Eva nodded eagerly. The prospect of working with the ranch's horses appealed to her far more than harvesting vegetables had. "I can do that." Across the ranch, Dr. Hoffman was assigned to prepare medical supplies for both humans and animals. Working alongside the local veterinarian, Dr. Samuel Miller, she inventoried medications, bandages, and tools that would travel with the drive. "You're pretty thorough," Dr. Miller remarked as Hoffman methodically organized the supplies. "In field hospitals, we learned that proper preparation saves lives," she replied through a ranch hand who spoke some German. "I imagine it's the same on cattle drives." Miller nodded appreciatively. "Exactly right. 20 miles might not sound far, but a lot can happen between here and there." The work continued through the morning. At noon, everyone gathered under a large oak tree for lunch. The German women sat together initially, but as the meal progressed, they gradually integrated with the ranch workers, communication flowing through gestures, the few English words they had learned, and the occasional translation from Johnson or bilingual ranch hands. Helga Brown found herself seated near Juan Vasquez, the Mexican-American foreman who had worked for the Chambers family for 15 years. Through halting Spanish, which was close enough to Latin for her to recognize some words, and his broken German picked up from previous German farmhands, they managed a rudimentary conversation. "You ride horses before?" Vasquez asked. Helga shook her head. "Never. In Germany, my family had no horses. Tomorrow maybe you try," he suggested. "Small horse, very gentle." Helga smiled uncertainly. "Maybe, if it's allowed." "Is allowed," Vasquez assured her. "Boss say everyone who works cattle must ride." This exchange was observed by Sergeant Johnson, who maintained a careful balance between allowing natural interaction and ensuring security protocols were followed. He had reported regularly to Colonel Washington on the developing relationships between the prisoners and locals, noting that these connections seemed to be having a positive effect on morale and compliance. The afternoon brought new tasks. Eva and Thomas moved from checking saddles to actually working with the horses, leading them from pasture to corral, brushing them down, and checking their hooves. "This one is Domino," Thomas explained, patting a black and white spotted gelding. "He'll be my mount for the drive." Eva ran her hand along the horse's powerful neck. He's beautiful, strong. Thomas nodded. Been with me since he was a colt. Horse like this you can trust with your life. I never thought I would be this close to such animals, Eva admitted. In Germany we saw horses in parades or pulling wagons. Not like this. Freedom looks different depending on where you stand, Thomas observed. Out here, a good horse means you can go anywhere, do anything. It's a kind of freedom city folks never know. This concept, freedom connected to movement, to partnership with an animal, rather than to political ideology, was new to Eva. It resonated with something she had felt during her riding lessons, a sense of possibility that transcended the confines of war and captivity. As the day progressed, the women proved themselves capable and increasingly confident. Even those with no prior experience with ranch work learned quickly, their military training having instilled adaptability and attention to detail. By late afternoon, Charlie Two Horses had made a decision. Approaching Colonel Washington, who had arrived to check on the work detail, he made an unexpected proposal. "These women have earned the right to see what they're helping prepare for," he said. "I'd like permission to take a small group on a short ride tomorrow, just to the North Ridge and back. Under guard, of course." Washington looked skeptical. "That would be highly irregular, Mr. Two Horses. These are prisoners of war, not ranch guests." "With respect, Colonel," Charlie replied, "they've worked harder than some paid hands I've known. A 2-hour ride within sight of the ranch would let them understand the purpose of all this preparation." Washington considered the request. "Let me consult with Sergeant Johnson. This would require additional security measures." After a private conversation with Johnson, who supported the proposal while suggesting specific precautions, Washington reluctantly agreed. 6 prisoners maximum with 6 guards. Stay within visual range of the ranch house, 2 hours no more. When the offer was presented to the women, the response was enthusiastic. Eva immediately volunteered, as did Helga, Dr. Hoffman, and 3 others, who had shown the most progress in their riding lessons. The next morning dawned clear and relatively cool by Texas summer standards. The selected women arrived early, their excitement evident despite attempts to maintain military composure. Each was assigned a gentle, well-trained horse and paired with an experienced rider, either a guard or ranch hand, who would stay close throughout the excursion. Eva was partnered with Thomas, Helga with Vasquez, and Dr. Hoffman with Charlie Two Horses. Sergeant Johnson would accompany them as both translator and security officer, while 3 additional guards completed the group. Before mounting, Charlie addressed the women. "Remember what you've learned. Stay with your partner. Listen to your horse. They sense danger before humans do. This isn't a race or a competition. We ride together. We return together." The women nodded, taking these instructions seriously. One by one they mounted their horses, adjusting to the feeling of sitting astride such powerful animals. Despite their nervousness, years of military discipline helped them maintain composure and follow directions carefully. The small cavalcade set out from the ranch, heading north at a walk. The guards positioned themselves strategically, 2 in front, 2 at the rear, and 2 interspersed among the prisoners. Johnson rode in the middle where he could observe everyone. As they crested the first gentle hill, the landscape opened before them. Rolling plains stretched toward the horizon, dotted with mesquite trees and occasional stands of oak. In the distance, a herd of cattle grazed, dark shapes against the golden grass. "This is Chambers land as far as you can see," Thomas explained to Eva, as Johnson translated for the benefit of all the women. "Been in the family for 3 generations." Eva took in the vastness of it. "In Germany, this much land would support many villages." "Different country, different ways," Thomas replied. "Out here, you need a lot of land to raise cattle. Not much water, not much good grass per acre." They continued north, gradually increasing to a gentle trot as the women demonstrated control over their mounts. For most, this was their first experience riding outside the confined space of the corral. The sensation of movement, of covering ground at a pace determined by both rider and horse, created a unique feeling of agency that had been absent in their lives since before their capture, perhaps even before the war. At the ridge that marked their turnaround point, Charlie called a halt. From this vantage, they could see for miles in all directions. The ranch buildings were visible to the south, while to the north the terrain became more rugged, with scattered patches of forest and the faint blue line of distant hills. The cattle will graze in those valleys beyond the trees, Charlie explained, pointing north. Better water, better grass. They'll stay there through fall, then return before winter. As they rested the horses, Dr. Hoffman turned to Charlie. Your people, the Comanche, did they move with the seasons too? Charlie nodded. We followed the buffalo, moved with the weather, not so different from these cattle drives except we carried our homes with us. And now? She asked hesitantly. A shadow crossed Charlie's face. Now most of my people live on reservations, much smaller than this. He gestured to the vast landscape around them. The old ways are mostly memory now. This glimpse into another culture's loss resonated with the German women in unexpected ways. Though the circumstances were entirely different, they too faced an uncertain future in a changing world. The Germany they had known was being transformed by war, just as the Comanche way of life had been altered by American westward expansion. The ride back to the ranch was quieter, each woman absorbed in her thoughts. The experience had affected them in ways they hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the physical freedom of riding across open country, but the psychological impact of seeing a different way of life, of being treated as capable individuals rather than enemy captives. As they approached the ranch, they could see a military vehicle parked near the house. Colonel Washington had returned, along with Lieutenant Weber, who had requested to check on her personnel. Weber watched with obvious disapproval as the riding party returned, the German women looking windblown but animated, chatting with their American escorts with a familiarity that violated her sense of proper military behavior. When they dismounted, Weber approached immediately. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded in German. "Fraternizing with the enemy while riding around like tourists." Eva stiffened at Weber's tone but held her ground. "We were invited to see the land where the cattle will be moved, Lieutenant. It helps us understand the work we're doing." "Work we shouldn't be doing at all," Weber snapped. "You've forgotten yourselves. You've forgotten your duty to the fatherland." Dr. Hoffman stepped forward. "With respect, Lieutenant, our duty now is to survive this captivity with dignity. These people have treated us fairly, even generously." Weber's face flushed with anger. "Generously? They've conquered you without firing a shot. Look at yourselves, taking orders from Negroes, socializing with Indians and Mexicans, behaving like common ranch hands instead of German soldiers." The confrontation was drawing attention. Sergeant Johnson moved closer, prepared to intervene if necessary, though he was careful not to translate Weber's more inflammatory statements. "Lieutenant," Helga said softly, "perhaps we could discuss this privately back at camp." Weber ignored her, focusing on Eva, who represented to her the greatest betrayal. "You especially, Müller. You were raised in the youth, you took the oath. And now I find you riding alongside this crippled boy, grinning like a fool." Thomas, who understood enough German to recognize the insult directed at him, reddened but remained silent. Eva, however, reacted with unexpected fire. "That's enough," she said sharply. "Thomas has shown me nothing but respect. All of them have. The only chains I've felt here are the ones in my own mind, the lies we were taught about these people." The assembled group fell silent. Even those who didn't understand German could sense the tension. Colonel Washington stepped forward, addressing Johnson. "Sergeant, please remind all parties that while I respect their right to internal discussions, I expect military discipline to be maintained." Johnson nodded and translated this in neutral terms. Weber, realizing she had lost control of the situation, drew herself up stiffly. "We will return to camp now," she announced to her women. "Those who wish to remain German soldiers will come with me." It was a moment of decision. For weeks, the women had been balancing their identity as German military personnel with their growing connection to the Americans. Now, Weber was forcing them to choose. After a moment of hesitation, Helga moved to stand beside Eva. Then Dr. Hoffman joined them. One by one, most of the women made their choice, until only Gertrude Keller and two others remained with Weber. Weber's face betrayed no emotion, but the rigid set of her shoulders spoke of profound betrayal. "Very well," she said coldly. "Colonel Washington, I request transportation back to the camp for myself and those who remember their duty." Washington, observing this schism without understanding the exact words, recognized its significance. "Of course, Lieutenant. A vehicle will be provided immediately." As Weber and her small group departed, an uncomfortable silence fell over the remaining women. They had effectively declared their independence from the chain of command that had governed their lives throughout the war. It was a small rebellion, but a profound one. Richard Chambers, who had watched the confrontation from the porch, approached the group. "I don't know exactly what just happened," he said, "but it seems to me these ladies have made a choice that couldn't have been easy. They deserve our respect for that." When Johnson translated this, the women straightened, their military bearing returning. They had not abandoned their identity as German soldiers, merely rejected an ideology that no longer aligned with the reality they were experiencing. The days that followed brought a new dynamic to Camp Hereford. The women who had chosen to remain with the work detail continued their preparation for the cattle drive, learning new skills and forming deeper connections with the Americans. Those who had returned with Weber kept to themselves, maintaining rigid adherence to military protocol and minimal interaction with guards or locals. Colonel Washington, recognizing the potential problems of this division, consulted with his superiors about the situation. The response from command was pragmatic. As long as security was maintained and the work program continued to show positive results, he was authorized to use his judgment. On the day before the cattle drive was to begin, Richard Chambers approached Washington with another proposal. "Some of these women have become essential to our preparations," he explained. "I'd like permission for 4 of them to accompany the first day of the drive, just to the halfway point. They'd return to the ranch by sundown." Washington's initial response was negative. "That's well beyond the security perimeter we've established, Mr. Chambers. I couldn't justify the risk." "What risk?" Chambers countered. "These women have had dozens of opportunities to attempt escape, if that was their intention. They're surrounded by open country in all directions. The fact that they've remained compliant suggests they understand their situation." After lengthy discussion, a compromise was reached. 2 prisoners, Eva Müller and Dr. Hoffman, would be permitted to ride with the drive to the Midway camp. Accompanied by Sergeant Johnson and 3 guards, they would assist with setting up the overnight camp, then return to the ranch before dark. When this opportunity was presented to the women, Eva and Dr. Hoffman accepted immediately. For Eva, it represented a chance to experience something she had only read about in adventure stories. For Dr. Hoffman, it was an opportunity to observe medical practices in a field situation, which aligned with her professional interests. The morning of the drive dawned with a flurry of activity. Cowboys moved among the cattle, getting them grouped for the journey north. Horses were saddled, last-minute supplies loaded onto wagons. The German women who weren't joining the drive helped with final preparations, their movements now confident and purposeful after weeks of training. Eva and Dr. Hoffman presented themselves to Sergeant Johnson, dressed in borrowed ranch clothes, jeans, checked shirts, and wide-brimmed hats to shield against the sun. They looked transformed from the uniformed military women who had arrived in Texas months earlier. "Remember," Johnson instructed them, "stay close to your assigned guards at all times. This is still a security operation, despite the unusual circumstances." The women nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation despite their excitement. They mounted their assigned horses, Eva on a steady bay mare named Penny, Dr. Hoffman on a gentle gelding called Doc, and took their places in the formation. Charlie, 2 horses, as trail boss, gave the signal to move out. The cowboys began urging the cattle forward, the herd moving slowly at first, then gaining momentum as they settled into the rhythm of the drive. For Eva, the experience was exhilarating. The thunder of 800 cattle moving across the plain, the shouts of the cowboys, the coordinated movement of horses and riders working together. It was unlike anything she had known in her structured military life. Even the dust and noise held a kind of raw beauty. Dr. Hoffman, more reserved by nature, was nevertheless deeply engaged, observing the efficiency with which the operation unfolded. As a military doctor, she appreciated the logistical complexity of moving so many animals across difficult terrain, keeping them healthy and together. Throughout the morning, the drive progressed steadily northward. Eva and Dr. Hoffman remained with their guards, following instructions carefully, occasionally assisting with tasks that matched their abilities. By midday, they had covered nearly 10 miles, the ranch now far behind them, the destination still hours ahead. During a brief rest to water the horses, Thomas rode up beside Eva. "What do you think?" he asked, his face dusty but grinning. "It's amazing," Eva replied through Johnson's translation. "So different from anything in Germany." "This is Texas," Thomas said simply, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. The vastness, the freedom, the peculiar mix of hardship and possibility that characterized the American West. Dr. Hoffman, overhearing this exchange, added her own observation. "In Germany, we're taught that strength comes from order, from everyone knowing their place and staying in it. But here, strength seems to come from adaptation, from different people working together because they choose to." When Johnson translated this, Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "My pa says America's like a stew, not a cake. Things don't blend completely, but they're stronger together than apart." This metaphor stayed with Eva and Dr. Hoffman as the drive continued through the afternoon. They observed how the diverse group of cowboys, Anglo, Mexican, Native American, worked in concert despite their different backgrounds. Each brought unique skills and perspectives to the common goal. By late afternoon, they reached the midway camp where the cattle would rest overnight. A creek provided water, while the surrounding meadows offered good grazing. The cowboys set about establishing the camp with practiced efficiency, securing the herd, setting up cooking equipment, caring for horses. Eva and Dr. Hoffman helped where they could, following the instructions of Charlie 2 horses, who assigned them to assist with preparing the evening meal. As they worked, they could see the cattle settling for the night, the cowboys establishing watches to prevent strays or stampedes. "This is where we leave you," Sergeant Johnson informed them as the sun began to lower toward the horizon. "We need to return to the ranch before dark." Eva looked around at the bustling camp, reluctant to leave this adventure. "We could stay," she suggested hesitantly. "Help with the night watch, return tomorrow." Johnson shook his head firmly. "Those aren't the terms Colonel Washington approved. We return today, as agreed." Recognizing that this wasn't negotiable, Eva and Dr. Hoffman prepared to depart. They said their goodbyes to Thomas, Charlie, and the others, who would continue with the drive to its destination. "Thank you," Eva told Thomas as they parted, "for showing me a different world." Thomas smiled. "Maybe someday when the war's over you can come back, see more of Texas." The return journey to the ranch was quieter, each rider absorbed in their thoughts. The setting sun cast long shadows across the plains, painting the landscape in gold and amber. For Eva and Dr. Hoffman, the day represented more than just an unusual break from captivity. It symbolized a profound shift in perspective. As they approached the Chambers Ranch, Dr. Hoffman broke the silence. "What happens after the war?" she asked Johnson. "To Germany, to us?" Johnson considered the question carefully. "I can't say for certain, but from what we hear, Germany will need rebuilding. It will need people who can see beyond the old ways, who can imagine a different future." "Like us?" Eva asked softly. Johnson nodded. "Exactly like you." Back at Camp Hereford, Lieutenant Weber received reports of the cattle drive from her remaining loyal followers, who had gleaned details from reluctant camp guards. She recorded everything meticulously in a journal she kept hidden from inspections: names, dates, perceived violations of military protocol, instances of fraternization. In her mind, she was preserving evidence for the day when German authorities would demand an accounting. But as summer turned to fall, even Weber could not ignore the steady stream of news indicating Germany's collapse, the liberation of Paris, the Soviet advance from the east, Allied bombing reducing German cities to rubble. Privately, she began to question whether her rigid adherence to a dying ideology served any purpose beyond her own psychological comfort. The catalyst for Weber's transformation came unexpectedly in late September. A new group of German POWs arrived at Camp Hereford, male soldiers captured during the Allied advance through France. Among them was Weber's brother, Klaus, whom she hadn't seen since 1941. Their reunion, permitted under Colonel Washington's compassionate interpretation of regulations, was bittersweet. Klaus was gaunt, exhausted, and missing his left arm below the elbow, the result of an American artillery shell. "Margie," he said, using her childhood name, "you wouldn't recognize Germany now. The cities are ruins. The people are starving. The war is lost, has been for months." Weber struggled to reconcile her brother's account with her steadfast beliefs. "The Führer has new weapons," she insisted. "The tide will turn." Klaus shook his head sadly. "That's what they told us too, right until American tanks rolled over our position." He leaned closer. "The Americans captured me 3 months ago. They could have left me to die. Many officers would have. Instead, a Negro medic saved my life, stayed with me through the night, talking to keep me awake, giving me his own water. When I asked why, he said, 'Because you're a human being.'" This simple statement, "because you're a human being," penetrated Weber's ideological armor in a way no amount of evidence or argument had managed to do. It forced her to confront the fundamental contradiction between Nazi racial theory and the lived reality of her captivity, where those deemed inferior had shown consistent humanity. The day after meeting with her brother, Weber approached Sergeant Johnson with an unprecedented request. "I would like to join the work detail," she said formally, "if the offer still stands." Johnson, surprised but diplomatic, nodded. "I'll speak with Colonel Washington. I'm sure arrangements can be made." Weber's integration into the work program was initially awkward. The women who had defied her authority months earlier were uncertain how to receive her. The Americans were wary of her motives. Weber herself struggled to adapt to a role where she was not in command. Yet gradually, almost imperceptibly, the barriers began to dissolve. Weber's military efficiency and attention to detail earned grudging respect. Her willingness to perform any task without complaint demonstrated a humility previously unseen. Most significantly, her interactions with the black guards and diverse ranch personnel showed a new openness, a willingness to see individuals rather than categories. By November, as news of German defeats dominated even the censored information available to the prisoners, the women of Camp Hereford had developed a new perspective on their situation. No longer viewing themselves primarily as captives, many had embraced their role in the local agricultural community. They had acquired skills, formed relationships, and begun to imagine lives beyond the war. Ava Müller, who had shown particular aptitude with horses, was offered a permanent position at the Chambers Ranch once hostilities ended. Dr. Hoffman established a professional relationship with the local medical community, consulting on cases that benefited from her expertise. Even Lieutenant Weber found purpose in organizing more formal educational exchanges between the prisoners and locals. As Christmas approached, Colonel Washington received new directives regarding the POW work program. With the war in Europe clearly heading toward Allied victory, emphasis was shifting toward preparation for eventual repatriation. The prisoners would be provided with information about conditions in Germany and opportunities for vocational training that might assist them in returning to a devastated homeland. A Christmas celebration was planned at the Chambers Ranch, bringing together the German women, their American guards, and the local community that had gradually accepted them. Tables were set up in the main barn, decorated with evergreen boughs and homemade ornaments. A small orchestra, composed of prisoners and locals, prepared traditional songs from both countries. On Christmas Eve, as snow dusted the Texas plains in an unusual white Christmas, the assembled group represented an unlikely community, forged through months of shared work and growing understanding. Colonel Washington, surveying the scene, reflected on the transformation he had witnessed, not just in the German prisoners, but in the local population and even his own men. Richard Chambers rose to offer a toast. "To peace in the coming year," he said simply, raising his glass. The German women, including Weber, joined in this sentiment. Whatever their feelings about the war's outcome, all could embrace the hope for an end to conflict. After the formal celebration, smaller groups gathered to continue the evening. Ava found herself near the corral with Thomas, watching the snow fall on the backs of horses. "Will you really stay?" Thomas asked. "After the war?" Eva considered the question. "I don't know if they'll let me, but I would like to." There's nothing for me in Germany now. Texas could use more good horse people, Thomas said, and the ranch will need help rebuilding after so many went to war. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Weber, who had come looking for Eva. The colonel has news, Weber said, her tone neutral. They're saying the war might be over by spring. Eva nodded. And then we go home, Weber replied, or what's left of it. She hesitated, then added, unless we find another home. This simple acknowledgement that home might be redefined represented Weber's final surrender of the ideology that had shaped her adult life. Like Germany itself, she would need to build something new from the ruins of the old. As the war in Europe reached its final months, the women of Camp Hereford prepared for an uncertain future. Some, like Eva, hoped to remain in America if permitted. Others planned to return to Germany, bringing with them new skills and perspectives that might contribute to rebuilding. A few, including Dr. Hoffman, had received tentative offers to work with international relief organizations. Their final ride together came in early April 1945, just days before news of Germany's collapse began to reach them. The group included both prisoners and guards, riding north from the Chambers Ranch to the grazing lands where they had delivered cattle the previous summer. At the ridge overlooking the valley, they paused, each woman contemplating the journey that had brought her to this place. From the rigid beliefs they had carried to America, through the gradual unraveling of certainties, to this moment of potential and possibility, it had been a transformation none could have imagined. What I'll remember, Eva said, breaking the contemplative silence, is that first day when Thomas offered me a horse instead of treating me like an enemy. Dr. Hoffman nodded, and how Sergeant Johnson spoke German better than most Berliners. Lieutenant Weber, who had been quiet throughout the ride, finally spoke. I'll remember that we came here expecting chains, but found something else entirely. Not freedom exactly. We are still prisoners of war. But dignity, respect, humanity. As they turned their horses back toward the ranch, toward the future neither war nor peace had yet defined, they carried with them a profound lesson. That freedom exists not just in national boundaries or political systems, but in the mind's capacity to recognize humanity across all divisions of race, nationality, and circumstance. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.